George Harrison was called the quiet beetle. He was gentle, spiritual, and always looking for peace. To millions of fans, he was the heart of the band. He was the one who probably wouldn't hold grudges. But that picture was only half true. Behind that calm look, he had anger so deep it never went away. And guess what? The person he hated most wasn't someone outside the band. It was one of his own music brothers. Stay with us as we find out the truth behind this hidden hate. Because once, you know why, you'll never see the Beatles the same way again. George Harrison was never happy in the Beatles. At the beginning, George Harrison looked up to John Lennon like a hero. Paul was charming, sure of himself, and really good at music in ways George loved as a teenager. They sat together on a Liverpool bus, sharing guitars, practicing chords, chasing the same dream of getting out of being poor through music. For George, getting Paul's approval meant everything. When Paul nodded and said good job, it was better than any clapping. In those times, George thought he had found not just a partner, but someone who saw him as equal. But looking up to someone soon started to hurt him. As the Beatles went from local clubs to big stages around the world, Paul and John became the songwriting kings. They were the faces of Beatlemania, the voices on magazine covers, the stars who took over every interview. George, meanwhile, became the quiet one. To the world, that name seemed nice, even sweet. But to George, it was like a jail. He wasn't quiet because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because every time he tried to speak, louder personalities, meaner comments, and endless focus on Lennon-McCartney took over. By the mid-1960s, George had songs burning inside him. These songs were just as good as anything Paul or John were writing. But when he shared them, people were cold to him. Paul often treated George's songs like side projects, things to squeeze in between his own big ideas. John could be mean, pushing away George's work with casual put-downs. Even when George showed something powerful like "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," nobody cared until he brought in Eric Clapton to play guitar, making the others notice what they had tried to ignore. For George, this wasn't just being turned down. It was being embarrassed. The unfairness became too much. On album after album, George was allowed only 2 or 3 songs, while Lennon and McCartney filled the records with their latest tries. It wasn't just about numbers. It was the attitude. Paul, who wanted everything perfect, would spend hours making his own songs better. But when it came to George's songs, he barely tried. George himself later said with anger, "Paul would always help along when you'd done his 10 songs. Then when he got around to doing one of mine, he would help. It was silly. It was very selfish." That selfishness made every studio time feel like a fight, where George felt like an unwanted soldier. The deeper sadness was personal. George and Paul had once been close like brothers, but as Paul took more control of the band, George felt pushed further back. Paul's control, once cool, now felt like he couldn't breathe. His constant directions, his need to play bass lines, guitar parts, even telling them how to arrange songs, left George with little room to be himself. In a 1974 interview, George said clearly, "I would join a band with John any day, but I could not join a band with Paul McCartney. He's a fine bass player, but he's a bit too controlling sometimes." Behind those carefully picked words were years of built-up anger, a hurt that never fully got better. By January 1969, the break burst into open fighting. During the famous Let It Be rehearsals at Twickenham Studios, cameras caught the suffocating feeling. Paul lectured, John pulled away, and George sat quiet until he couldn't take it anymore. His words, calm but icy cold, broke the room. "I think I'll be leaving the band now. Get a replacement." With that, he walked out. For 12 days, the Beatles, the greatest band in history, almost ended. The world never knew how close they came to breaking up, not because of drugs or money, but because George Harrison could no longer stand being constantly dismissed by the men he once looked up to. When George came back, it wasn't making up. It was giving up. The band moved from Twickenham to Apple Studios. Paul's plan for a live concert was dropped, and George agreed to continue. But in his heart, something had broken. The friendship he once felt with Paul was gone. The looking up to him had turned to bitterness. What once felt like brotherhood now felt like being a servant. He wasn't a partner. He was a guest in a club that never really welcomed him. Even years later, the scars were easy to see. In his life storybook, I, Me, Mine, published in 1980, George barely talked about Lennon and spoke of Paul carefully and distantly. The silence was louder than anger. It told the world that the hurts of being overshadowed, made fun of, and ignored had never healed. For George Harrison, the Beatles were not the dream of brotherhood the fans imagined. They were a cage. What the world celebrated as harmony, George remembered as being trapped. That unspoken pain went into every note he would later write, into every careful word he let the public hear. And it was this pain that explained why, when history looked back, George was no longer willing to be silent. His story inside the Beatles was not one of giving up, but of fighting back, waiting to be born. The battle for George Harrison to be noticed. George Harrison's return to the Beatles in 1969 was not giving up. It was changing into something new. Something inside him had snapped at Twickenham Studios, and although he walked back into the studio, he was no longer the same George who had once accepted silence as his job. He came back armed with determination. He would not accept being the third Beatle in a group where only two men seemed to matter. From that moment, George Harrison was ready to fight. His weapon was not words. He didn't like shouting matches with Lennon or McCartney. His weapon was song. For almost 10 years, George had been quietly saving melodies, keeping pieces, polishing lines of poetry that no one had bothered to ask about. Lennon and McCartney were too busy competing with each other, too caught up with their own brilliance to think that George might be preparing his own revolution. But by 1969, the dam burst. Songs poured from George's guitar, raw and demanding, needing to be heard. The proof came in Abbey Road. The album was meant to be a goodbye song, but for George, it was an arrival. For years, his songs had been tucked away like afterthoughts, 2 per album, sometimes 3 if he was lucky. But now George delivered Here Comes the Sun and Something. They were not just good. They were impossible to ignore. Here Comes the Sun, written in Eric Clapton's garden, sparkled with hope after months of band trouble. Something, on the other hand, was pure love. A love song so universal that even Lennon admitted it was the best track on the record. Paul called it the best George ever wrote. Frank Sinatra went further, calling it the greatest love song of the last 50 years. For the first time, the Beatles released a George Harrison song as an A-side single, paired with Lennon's Come Together. It topped charts around the world. A win that should have been sweet. To the public, George Harrison had finally stepped out of the shadows. But inside the band, being noticed was more complicated. Lennon seemed distant, offering little praise. Paul, though supportive in interviews, still acted like he was the architect of the Beatles' sound. To George, the silence was deafening. He had broken through the wall, but the clapping he most wanted from the men who had once dismissed him was quiet, reluctant, almost angry. That contradiction defined the tragedy of George's late Beatles years. He was at the peak of his creativity, writing some of the most lasting songs in the band's catalog. Yet the environment poisoned his victories. Every success reminded him not of validation, but of how long he had been denied. Each compliment felt late, grudging, empty. He had been right all along, and being right only made the hurt deeper. When the band finally broke apart in 1970, George wasted no time proving what he had kept inside for so long. While Lennon and McCartney launched solo projects, George exploded. All Things Must Pass was not just an album. It was a triple album, a flood of songs that Lennon and Paul had ignored, brushed aside, or simply failed to understand. Suddenly, the quiet Beatle unleashed a body of work so overwhelming that it stunned the world. My Sweet Lord, the lead single, became the first solo Beatle song to hit #1 in the United States. The record sold millions, towering over Lennon's Plastic Ono Band and McCartney's self-titled first album. For George, it was proof he was right. Every note of All Things Must Pass was a declaration of independence, a cry of revenge against years of being told he wasn't good enough. Listeners marveled at the size of it. Critics called it the album Lennon and McCartney never saw coming. But for George, success was not without bitterness. He knew he could only create it because the cage of the Beatles had been shattered. The very band that should have helped his genius had instead forced him to bury it until he could no longer stay silent. Paul McCartney himself admitted years later that they had underestimated George. In a 2020 interview, Paul thought back, "It was easy to underestimate George because me and John had always written most of the stuff and had most of the singles. George was a late bloomer as far as writing was concerned, but boy did he bloom. He wrote some of the greatest songs ever." That confession, while honest, came decades too late. To George, it was proof of what he had felt all along. His best work had been overlooked, his talent dismissed until the world forced Paul to admit it. And yet, even at the height of his solo success, George could not escape the scars of the past. In interviews, his resentment came up like an old wound reopened. In 1974, he spoke bluntly, "I would rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney." It was not just a critique of Paul's musical style. It was a rejection of the years he had felt overpowered, smothered, undermined. He admitted he could never imagine joining a band with Paul again. The bitterness was clear. For all their history, for all their brotherhood, Paul was a figure George could never forgive completely. The tragedy lay in the emptiness of victory. George had proven himself. He had achieved #1 singles, critical acclaim, Grammy recognition. He had organized the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, one of the first major benefit concerts in rock history, raising millions for humanitarian aid. He had become more than a Beatle. He was a cultural force in his own right. And yet in quiet moments George admitted the truth. Success did not heal the pain of being dismissed for so long. He once remarked half-jokingly that even if he wrote the greatest song in history, it would still be treated as just George's song compared to John or Paul's. This bitterness was not just about pride. It was about identity. George had entered. The Beatles as the youngest, the apprentice, the boy with wide eyes. He had hoped the band would grow with him, allow him space to evolve into something more. Instead, the walls closed in. Paul's perfectionism, John's sarcasm, the press's quiet Beatle label, all of it left George feeling trapped, erased, voiceless. His later triumphs were acts of rebellion, born not from joy, but from defiance. He had to prove himself not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. Even in his autobiography, I, Me, Mine, George's silence about Lennon and his guarded references to Paul spoke louder than words. To fans, the omissions were shocking. To George, they were deliberate. He had erased the men who had once overshadowed him. It was a final act of resistance. If they had ignored him in life, he would ignore them in memory. The quiet Beatle, after all, had found his voice not in confrontation, but in silence, sharpened into revenge. But was he satisfied? That is the tragic question. On paper, George Harrison had everything: chart-topping hits, solo acclaim, respect from critics and fellow musicians. Paul eventually admitted his greatness. The world sang his songs, covered them, made them immortal. Later, George himself seemed restless, haunted by the years of dismissal. He sought peace in Indian philosophy, in gardening, in retreating from fame. He filled his home with music and prayer, not applause. For him, true recognition had come too late, and it could never undo the pain of being silenced when it mattered most. That lingering wound set the stage for what came next. The cold reality of life after the Beatles, when fractured friendships became permanent scars. The tragic end of George Harrison's feud with Paul. When the storm of the 1970s finally settled, the four Beatles drifted into separate worlds. Yet, while Paul McCartney carried his wounds into Wings, and Lennon retreated into domestic seclusion with Yoko Ono, George Harrison remained defined by one word: distance. It was not only distance from the world's expectations of another Beatles record. It was distance from Lennon himself. By the time the 1980s dawned, that distance had hardened into something unmovable. Lennon's assassination in December 1980 should have shattered the wall. For many fans, they imagined Harrison breaking down in grief, confessing to the press that, beneath all the resentments, still lived a brotherhood unbroken. But the reality was painfully colder. Harrison's response was guarded, even awkward. He described Lennon's death not in the language of close grief, but in the tone of a man who had lost someone he barely knew anymore. It's difficult to take in. He was murdered, but he'll live on in his music. The words were true, but they were clinical. For millions expecting heartbreak, Harrison's reaction exposed just how far Lennon had fallen in his heart. The silence was almost deafening. Paul McCartney struggled to say his sorrow, fumbling with the now infamous comment that it was a drag. Ringo Starr flew to New York to comfort Yoko. But George, he chose to remain in England, wrapped in the very solitude that Lennon had once mocked as mystical nonsense. For a man who had spent his life writing about love, peace, and spiritual awakening, Harrison's inability or unwillingness to mourn Lennon publicly was seen as shocking. Fans whispered, had the hatred run so deep that even death could not dissolve it? The truth lay somewhere between tragedy and survival. George had spent so many years feeling diminished, ignored, ridiculed by Lennon, that grief was complicated by scar tissue. To him, Lennon's voice was not only the voice of Imagine or Strawberry Fields. It was also the voice that had sneered at his songs, laughed at his sitar, and dismissed his devotion to India as escapist. When Lennon died, Harrison wasn't only mourning a man. He was forced to mourn a relationship that had never healed. And in that space, the silence became his last act of defiance. But silence carried a cost. It left George with nowhere to place the anger, nowhere to bury the unresolved pain. So he poured it into his work. In the early 1980s, as he released Somewhere in England, fans heard not only the sound of a seasoned artist, but also the echo of a man still negotiating wounds that time refused to close. Music became both an escape and a mask, proof to the world that he was moving forward, even when his heart was trapped in the shadows of the past. As the years rolled on, the fractures inside Harrison's heart never fully healed. His spiritual path deepened, but it also became a shield. Friends noticed that he often avoided direct conversations about Lennon, preferring to turn the subject toward karma, destiny, or the fleeting nature of life. It was easier to philosophize than to confront the rawness of betrayal. For Harrison, Lennon was not only dead in the physical sense, he was erased in memory, dissolved into the fog of something unspeakable. The tragedy was magnified in the 1990s. While McCartney sought to cement his legacy and Starr enjoyed a resurgence as a touring act, Harrison withdrew further into his private sanctuary at Friar Park. The irony was painful. The man who had fought, hardest to be heard within the Beatles, had chosen a life of retreat, gardening and chanting, as though the scars of those years had convinced him the spotlight was poison. And yet, even in retreat, Lennon haunted him. Interviews with Harrison often turned into subtle battles. Reporters would inevitably ask about Lennon, and George would tense, Sometimes he dismissed the question with a bitter laugh, sometimes with silence. What he never offered was reconciliation. The wound remained open. Then came 1999, when Harrison nearly lost his life in a violent home invasion. A deranged attacker broke into Friar Park and stabbed him multiple times. Harrison survived, but the brush with death left him shaken. Lying in hospital, weakened and scarred, he spoke to friends about the fragility of existence. Some thought this would finally be the moment when he softened toward Lennon's memory. But again, the silence prevailed. The stabbing had reminded him of mortality, yet it did not dissolve the bitterness that Lennon had left behind. The final years were even more tragic. Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997, a cruel irony for a man whose voice had once carried his deepest truths. He fought the illness with determination, seeking treatment in Switzerland and the US. But by 2001, the disease had spread to his lungs. As death approached, Harrison spoke often about God, about the soul's journey, about letting go of earthly attachments. Yet even in his meditations, Lennon's absence was palpable. Unlike McCartney, who publicly honored Lennon at concerts, or Starr, who spoke of him with warmth, Harrison remained largely silent. His refusal to romanticize Lennon in death was perhaps his final act of rebellion, a quiet but brutal truth that not all bonds can be mended by time. When Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at age 58, the world mourned the quiet beetle. Tributes poured in, celebrating his artistry, his spirituality, his humility. But beneath the public grief lay an unspoken question. Had his life been permanently scarred by the man he could never forgive? For many fans, the most tragic realization was that George Harrison's hatred, directed at Lennon, fueled by years of neglect and humiliation, had never been resolved. Lennon died suddenly, leaving no chance for reconciliation, and Harrison followed 2 decades later, carrying the weight of that unfinished story into the grave. Even in death, the tension lingered. When the concert for George was held at the Royal Albert Hall in 2002, McCartney and Starr performed together in tribute. They spoke warmly of their lost friend, painting him as a man of love and laughter. But when it came to Lennon, the silence hung over the proceedings. Harrison's life had ended without closure, and his memorial seemed to reflect that unfinished wound. It was as if the ghost of Lennon hovered not as a friend remembered, but as an unresolved shadow. And yet, Harrison's legacy refuses to be defined solely by bitterness. The very pain Lennon inflicted pushed him to create some of his greatest works. All Things Must Pass remains a towering masterpiece precisely because it was born from the ashes of rejection. Songs like Isn't It a Pity and Beware of Darkness were not just music. They were weapons forged from wounds. Even his embrace of Indian spirituality, mocked by Lennon, outlived the cynicism and became a cornerstone of Western culture's fascination with the East. Ironically, in trying to belittle George, Lennon had only sharpened his resolve to build something greater. Still, the tragedy remains haunting. George Harrison may have reached spiritual peace, but the human story beneath was bruised beyond repair. He never had the final conversation with Lennon, never heard the apology that might have healed him. Instead, his silence became his last word. For fans, it is this silence that hurts the most. To love the Beatles is to believe in brotherhood, in 4 who conquered the world together. But George Harrison reminds us of the darker truth. Sometimes admiration turns to hatred, and sometimes that hatred lasts a lifetime. So was George's story one of triumph or torment? Did his genius flourish because of the pain, or despite it? The peace he searched for until his dying breath, was it found? Was it Paul McCartney who defined George's greatness, or Paul McCartney who defined his suffering? What do you think? Was Paul McCartney truly the one man George Harrison hated more than anyone? Or was their feud simply the price of being bound together in the world's most famous band? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more tragic stories behind the greatest legends in music, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next.